Following two defeats last weekend for the Fighting Nerds, it's up to Jean Silva to get the team back to winning ways this Saturday as he takes on former title challenger Diego Lopes in what is an all-Brazilian main event. So in today's video, we're going to break down how this fight's going to look, take a look at one weapon of Jean Silva's that could either be his route to victory or defeat, and of course, I'll end the video with a prediction. Hello guys, and welcome back to Alex on MMA. Sorry it's been a while. I was on vacation with my family in Marbella in sunny Spain, so I didn't do a follow-up video on UFC Paris that I did promise I was going to do. But if you stick around to the very end of this video, I'll make sure to give a quick mention to it then. And before we get into this fight breakdown, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment below, how do you see this one going? And I want to start by taking a look at where both fighters are heading into this one. Now with Diego Lopes, he's coming off that loss to Alexander Volkanovski, and having rewatched that fight, I'm still of the same opinion as when I first watched it, is that Diego Lopes could have done a lot more in that fight. I was really underwhelmed by his performance. However, looking back at it now, I definitely see that as a learning fight because he said so much himself afterwards. He knows that he could have done more, turned up the gears after he got Volkanovski hurt, but then again, he was fighting an all-time great and he recognised that. So really, I'm not looking at that loss at this stage of his career as a really bad one because I think he's going to take a lot from that fight and apply it to this one here. And then if we take a look at Jean Silva's most recent matchup, that was his real first test in the featherweight division against a ranked opponent in the form of Bryce Mitchell. And after watching that fight again, although Bryce Mitchell put up a good fight in that first round, Jean Silva just seemed to overwhelm him in the end, getting that submission victory. But I do have to caveat that because I'm not the biggest Bryce Mitchell fan. I think there's a lot of stuff he does really badly. I'm really not impressed by his striking. I think he's a solid grappler, clearly got very good jiu-jitsu, but I don't think this was the best test for Jean Silva at this point, especially when he's going up so many levels against Diego Lopes. We've just seen Bryce Mitchell going down in weight and fighting a lower ranked opponent at bantamweight. So Jean Silva having this victory over ranked featherweight doesn't really tell you all that much in terms of level of competition. And look, when we are talking about where both fighters are heading into this one, yes, Diego Lopes is the fighter coming off a loss, but it's impossible to ignore the fact that two of Jean Silva's teammates, the Fighting Nerds who had this aura about them, they're coming off pretty bad losses last weekend. How much of an impact will that have in Jean Silva? We'll find out on Saturday night, but it's definitely something to consider. Okay, so that's where both fighters are heading into this one, and as we move on to the technical breakdown of this fight, there's a few certain techniques from both fighters that stand out to me, and the one key one for Jean Silva that could either be his undoing in this fight or lead him to victory is his left hook. And I've brought up a clip from Jean Silva's UFC debut after he got his contract on Dana White's Contender Series against Westin Wilson. And in this clip, we're going to see the best version of Jean Silva's left hook, in my opinion anyway, which is when he uses it as a counter punch. As you can see, Westin Wilson opens up there with a jab, leaving the right side of his body completely open. His right hand is very low there. And Jean Silva just takes a little step back, little lean back. Mark Goddard's big head's going to block out most of the action here. But as you can see, he really lifts that elbow high, gets his shoulder up nice and high, and lands a left hook over the top there as Westin Wilson tries to follow up with a right hand. Really effective, has a really big impact. And this actually led towards the finish of this fight, Jean Silva scoring a first round knockout in this fight. And I completely understand at this point if you're thinking, how the hell can a nice counter left hook be a weakness here? And I don't think that the counter shot's a weakness at all for Jean Silva, but he does throw the left hook very often. It's one of his favourite shots. And a lot of the time he throws it without a setup. Now, a bit of a tangent here, but I was actually with Liam Harrison earlier today, the multiple world champion Thai boxer, one of the greatest British Thai boxers of all time. And he was telling me about his left hook, which is a weapon that he's used to knock out countless opponents. And the most important thing for him isn't power, it's not speed, it's the setup. Because if you set it up well, it means that you can't get countered yourself, and you can time it much better. However, I think that Jean Silva throws this shot far too empty. And look, there's levels to this game. Westin Wilson is a much lower level opponent than Diego Lopes. But as you can see here in this clip, Jean Silva just steps in, so he enters the void as Demetrius Johnson names it. So he's in this position here, in this window where he can easily be caught by a good shot. And he throws this real wild looping left hook, which does connect with Weston Wilson here because he doesn't really do anything to get out of the way. He's a bit of a static opponent. But seeing shots like this does worry me. Look, maybe it's a case that Jean Silva knew the level of opposition that he was up against and that he could just throw these empty shots because he's not scared about what's coming back his way. But try this against a fighter like Diego Lopes, and I think he's in for a really, really bad time. And if you've been watching my videos for any amount of time, you'll know that I don't like to make these assumptions about fighters unless I've got evidence to back it up. So as you can see in this fight clip between Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes at the Sphere, a highlight I'm sure you've all seen many times before, Brian Ortega opens up with a double jab, just trying to feel his way in before throwing a right hand of his own. And Diego Lopes dips his head. And he keeps that left hand really well disciplined there by his temple and throws an overhand right. You can see that coming all the way through. Hits a completely open target in Brian Ortega, who's just entered the void with no defense. What did we just say about the Jean Silva clip? He lunged in with a big left hook with his hands down, his head there to be hit. And here you can see that Diego Lopes just punished Brian Ortega, sent him to sleep with that right hand. Let's keep it playing through just because this was a beautiful combination. Very fast hand speed as well that we're going to get into in a second. And he wakes him up with that follow-up left hook. Just a beautiful, fast-handed combination. So it's a really important point to note here. Jean Silva, he loves that left hook. It's one of his favourite punches to throw. But if he throws it empty with no setup, or if he's not using it as a counter punch, he really leaves himself vulnerable. And I think against a fighter like Diego Lopes, who has fantastic hand speed when he's in close range, he's really leaving himself vulnerable there. I think that power is also another factor we have to consider here, because Diego Lopes will be the most powerful puncher that Jean Silva's faced so far. Not only does he have fast hands, he's also got very powerful hands. As we can see in this clip against Volkanovski, where Volkanovski was getting a bit too comfortable in the pocket, Diego Lopes was able to force his head back with a nice jab through the middle, and then he followed it up with a solid right hand. We're going to keep it playing forward. You can see that right hand coming from a while away. That just cracked Volkanovski on the chin and sent him backwards. Look, this was a bit more of a flash knockdown, as you could see there. Volkanovski was leaning back on his back foot. But anyway, the point still stands that Diego Lopes, not only does he have fast hands when Jean Silva enters that pocket, he's also very powerful, so he needs to be really careful of that. And we are going to move on to talk about their physicality and their ground game soon. But I just want to end with this clip because it sounds like I'm very pro Diego Lopes at this stage. And don't get me wrong, I think his resume is much better than Jean Silva's, clearly much better than Jean Silva's at this time. But there is one weakness that I've spotted him do time and time again, and it's when he throws kicks. Another point that's so important in these striking matches is that you throw your shots, but don't leave yourself vulnerable when you're throwing your shots. I said the same thing about Diego Lopes' left hook. It's only fair that I make the same point here. And Diego Lopes is very guilty of doing this when he throws a kick. As you can see here against Volkanovski, he throws a right kick that kind of, is he either going for a front kick or a roundhouse kick where his leg isn't really extended? But he just leaves himself completely vulnerable to a counter from Volkanovski. And this might seem like a really small example. It didn't have a massive impact. But I think it's really important to note, because if Jean Silva is looking for openings, when Diego Lopes does throw a kick, be it a low kick or a body kick or a head kick, he stays in range, he doesn't move away afterwards, and he's open to a counter himself. So there are a few striking clips that I thought would be interesting. And I do want to speak about the physicality of both guys and the grappling, because I've heard people arguing online that this is going to be very close because Volkanovski was able to bully Diego Lopes when he grabbed him against the fence. But Volkanovski is the strongest guy in featherweight history. He's probably right up there with the strongest guy in featherweight history. And he can do that to anyone in that division, probably apart from former featherweight champion Ilia Topuria. I just don't think that Jean Silva's going to have any physical advantage over Diego Lopes. And should it go to the ground, Diego Lopes is so much more tried and tested, a higher level jiu-jitsu player than Jean Silva is. So I do think we're going to see a stand-up battle here. I think it'll just suit both guys over the 5 rounds. However, do not be surprised that if Jean Silva is able to land that left hook on Diego Lopes, I don't think Lopes would think twice about shooting, even if it's just to clear the cobwebs, maintain top position, position, possibly threaten some kind of arm triangle from the top. But really, I think this is very much going to be a stand-up battle. So I definitely think that Diego Lopes has an advantage there. But if both guys want to test each other's strength on the feet, see how they are in the clinch, I can see that being a lot more 50-50. I know that Jean Silva landed a really nice uppercut to knock out Charles Jourdain from a kind of semi-clinch. He had one arm around his neck position. And Diego Lopes landed some brutal shots on Brian Ortega in the clinch. So both guys are very comfortable there as well. I'm expecting a really nice technical stand-up battle this Saturday. So overall, what do I think that both guys need to focus on in this fight? With Jean Silva, I've made that very clear. He needs to go to his left hook. It's such a good weapon for him, but he needs to be able to set it up a lot more intelligently than we've seen in the past. Whether that's disguising it with low kicks with his right hand, or if it's baiting Diego Lopes to enter his range and then get it off as a counter shot. I think that'll be really important. As for Diego Lopes, I think he can afford to play the waiting game a bit more, because if Jean Silva does enter his space, then I'd really rate Diego Lopes' hand speed and his power in the pocket. I think he's just going to be too much for Jean Silva there. And with that being said, let's move on to my final prediction. Do I think the Fighting Nerds streak, losing streak, is going to continue with another one this weekend? Unfortunately, I think that it will. I think that Jean Silva probably has been pushed too high up the division too soon. I know there's a bit of a bottleneck at featherweight at the moment, but I just think Diego Lopes can do too much. He's too good on the ground if it goes there, and his hands are just a bit too fast to deal with a fighter who likes to really control the pace of a fight, likes to be quite floaty in and out. I think whenever he does enter that range, he's not going to have it his own way. He's going to be eating 2 or 3 punch combinations on his way in, and I can see him getting stopped in the 4th round. I'm going for a 4th round TKO, Diego Lopes beating Jean Silva. I think we're going to see Jean Silva looking quite tired rounds 2 and 3. I think he may run out of options by that point. I just think there's difference in levels at this point of both guys' careers. I'm not saying that Jean Silva can't get there, but I just think going from Bryce Mitchell to Diego Lopes is too much of a step up at this point. Guys, let me know if you agree with this breakdown. Like I said, I just wanted to pick out a couple of techniques from each guys that I thought would be interesting to explore. If you agree with my takes, if you disagree, let me know below. If you're not subscribed to the channel already, please do, and I'll see you in the next video.